In the frozen quiet of January 1547, the air inside Windsor Castle did not move. It was thick. It was heavy. It carried the weight of a dying era. The most powerful man in the Western world, King Henry VIII, was finally still. But inside the lead-lined coffin where his body had been sealed, a different kind of energy was building. This is not the peaceful rest you see in the movies. This was a biological pressure cooker. You were taught that kings die with dignity. You were told they are laid to rest with grace, surrounded by the soft glow of candlelight and the silent prayers of the faithful. That is a comforting fiction. The reality of Henry's end was a violent, chemical nightmare that the Tudor crown spent centuries trying to scrub from the history books. The king's body was massive. At the time of his death, he weighed nearly 400 pounds. This was not just fat. It was a collection of fluid, infection, and necrotic tissue. When the breath finally left his lungs, the bacteria inside his gut began their work. They didn't care about his titles. They didn't care that he had declared himself the supreme head of the church. To them, he was simply a vast, untapped source of fuel. As the temperature inside the chapel fluctuated, the gases produced by decomposition began to expand. Carbon dioxide, methane, hydrogen sulfide. In a wooden casket, these gases might have seeped through the cracks. But Henry was sealed in lead. The metal was soldered shut, creating an airtight vault. For hours, the pressure climbed. The lead began to bulge. The soldered seams groaned under a force they were never designed to hold. Then, it happened. It wasn't a bang. It was a wet, metallic snap. The coffin ruptured from within. The force was so great that it split the heavy casing wide open, spraying the interior of the chapel with a liquid so foul it defied description. This was the unholy echo that historical records tried to ignore. The king had literally exploded. The guards posted at the entrance of the choir in St. George's Chapel didn't see it happen, but they felt it. A wall of sulfurous rot hit them like a physical blow. It was a stench so thick it burned their throats. These were battle-hardened men. They had seen war. They had seen the filth of the London streets. But this was different. This was the smell of a sovereign liquefying. They staggered backward, gasping for air, their discipline collapsing in the face of a biological assault. They fled their posts, leaving the doors unguarded. When the attendants finally gathered the courage to return with torches, they found a scene that belonged in a horror painting. Because the doors had been left open, stray dogs, scavengers that lived on the fringes of the castle, had found their way inside. They were drawn by the scent. Imagine the flickering orange light hitting the stone floor. Imagine the silence of the chapel broken only by a wet, rhythmic sound. The dogs were crouched low around the broken lead. Their tongues were dragging through the dark, viscous fluid that was leaking from the King of England. The man who had bent an entire civilization to his will, the man who had executed queens and defied popes, was now nothing more than a meal for strays. This was the final, brutal truth of the Tudor line. The Golden Prince had become a source of nourishment for the lowest animals in his kingdom. But to understand how he ended up in that broken box, we have to go back. We have to look at the years of agony that turned his body into a living tomb. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. To understand the rupture in the chapel, you have to understand the rupture in the man. The history books want you to remember the portraits. They show you a massive, square-shouldered king draped in ermine fur and gold thread. He looks like a mountain of immovable power. But those portraits are the original propaganda. They were painted to hide a biological collapse that was turning the King of England into a walking corpse. The year was 1536. Before this moment, Henry was the Golden Prince of Europe. He was an athlete. He was a dancer. He was a man who could outride, out-wrestle, and out-hunt any nobleman in his court. He was over 6 feet tall in an age of small men. He was the physical embodiment of the Renaissance. But on January 24th, on a frozen jousting strip at Greenwich Palace, that man died. Imagine the sound of the tilt yard, the rhythmic thud of hooves on hard-packed earth, the whistle of the wind through the eye slits of a steel helmet. Henry was mounted on a destrier, a warhorse bred for pure violence. He was wearing 60 pounds of articulated steel. He was a human tank. When he collided with his opponent, the force was equivalent to a modern car crash. Henry was ripped from his saddle. He didn't just fall, he was launched. His armored body hit the frozen ground with a sickening metallic clang. But the horse, 1,500 pounds of panicked muscle, lost its footing as well. It buckled. It collapsed directly onto the king. Half a ton of animal and iron crushed Henry into the dirt. He lay unconscious for 2 full hours. The court held its breath. If he died, the Tudor line died with him. But when he finally opened his eyes, the man who woke up was a stranger. Something had shattered inside his skull. Modern science calls it a traumatic brain injury, specifically affecting the frontal lobe, the part of the brain that controls empathy, impulse, and rage. But the damage wasn't just in his head. A deep, jagged gash had opened on his left thigh. The edge of his own armor had been driven into his muscle by the weight of the horse. In 1536, there were no germ theories. There were no sterile bandages. There was only the theory of humors and the desperate prayers of useless doctors. They cleaned the wound with wine and wrapped it in linen, but the damage reached the bone. The injury developed into chronic osteomyelitis. This is a bone infection that acts like a slow-motion explosion. Bacteria moved into the marrow of his femur. Because the body couldn't kill the infection, it tried to push it out. It created ulcers, open, cratered holes in his skin that refused to heal for the next 11 years. You have to visualize the daily reality of the most powerful man in the world. Beneath the silk stockings and the velvet robes, his legs were rotting. The skin was blackened and tight. The ulcers were the size of a fist, constantly weeping a cocktail of yellow pus and dark, necrotic fluid. This wasn't just a medical condition, it was a sensory assault. The king was decomposing while he was still drawing breath. The infection turned his blood toxic. It sent spikes of white-hot agony through his nervous system with every step he took. He couldn't walk. He couldn't ride. He became a prisoner of his own chair, eating 5,000 calories a day to numb the pain, watching his body expand while his mind fractured into paranoia. The man in the chapel didn't just explode because of death. He exploded because he had been a pressurized vessel of infection and agony for over a decade. The rupture in the coffin was simply the final act of a biological war that Henry had been losing since that day in the frozen dirt. The Tudor court was a place of extreme artifice. It was a world of velvet, silk, and whispered poetry. But if you were to walk toward the king's private apartments in the 1540s, the artifice would vanish long before you reached the door. It would be replaced by a physical reality so grim that even the bravest knights of the Garter struggled to keep their composure. You have to imagine the sensory war. The smell of Henry's chambers was not the smell of a palace, it was the smell of a battlefield hospital. It was the scent of active, wet gangrene mixed with the heavy, cloying perfume of musk and rosewater used in a futile attempt to mask the rot. The king was a 400-pound man who could no longer move his own limbs without a pulley system, trapped in a room where the air was thick with the literal particles of his own decaying flesh. This is where the physicians to the crown earned their keep. They were the most elite medical minds in England, and they were utterly terrified. Every single morning, They had to perform a ritual that would be considered torture by any modern standard. They didn't have antibiotics. They didn't have sterile gloves. They had bronze bowls, linen rags, and their bare hands. The king would be propped up, his massive, swollen legs laid out before them. The ulcers, those cratered, weeping holes in his thighs, would be crusting over with dried discharge and dead skin from the night before. Because the infection was deep in the bone, the body was constantly trying to eject the poison. The fluid had nowhere to go but out. The doctors had to lean in. They had to press their fingers into the blackened, inflamed tissue surrounding the wounds. Imagine the king's roar of agony as they applied pressure. They weren't just cleaning him, they were manually milking the infection. They squeezed the ulcers until the yellow-green pus and the dark, foul-smelling liquid began to fountain into the bowls. Sometimes, fragments of the king's own femur, tiny, splintered shards of bone killed by the infection, would surface through the open meat of his leg. They had to pick these out with tweezers or their fingernails. There was no anesthesia. There was no laudanum strong enough to dull a bone infection of this magnitude. Henry felt every scrape of the linen against the raw nerve endings. He felt the internal pressure as they forced the pockets of fluid to burst. He screamed so loudly that the sound could be heard in the courtyards below, a terrifying reminder to every courtier that their God-appointed ruler was being eaten alive by microscopic invaders. The doctors knew that a single slip, a single moment of unnecessary pain, or a failure to clear the wound could result in their own execution. They were working on a human landmine. If they pressed too hard, the king might strike out in a brain-damaged rage. If they didn't press hard enough, the infection would turn systemic and kill him, and they would be blamed for his death. Every day, the pile of blood-soaked, pus-stained linen grew. Every day, the king's body became more of a laboratory for decay. His skin was translucent in some places and coal-black in others. The Golden Prince had been replaced by a creature of tubes, bandages, and unending screams. This was the hidden engine of the Tudor state, a room full of rotting meat and the men forced to touch it. When a king begins to rot, the kingdom must learn to lie. This was the burden of the Tudor Privy Council. They were no longer governing a nation. They were managing a biological catastrophe. If the courts of France or Spain discovered that the King of England was a 400-pound invalid whose legs wept poison, the borders would have been crossed by sunset. Power in the 16th century was physical. If the king was broken, the crown was broken. You have to look at the palaces themselves. They were being surgically altered to hide the king's collapse. This is the part of history that isn't in the tour guides. At Whitehall and Hampton Court, the very floors were failing. Henry's weight had become so immense, over 400 pounds of dense bone, fat, and fluid, that the standard oak floorboards groaned and splintered beneath his feet. Imagine the sound of timber screaming. The council had to order carpenters to go beneath the floorboards, into the dark crawl spaces of the palace, to install massive secondary beams. They were reinforcing the architecture of England so it wouldn't collapse under the weight of one man. But Henry couldn't walk anymore. His legs were no longer pillars, they were open sores. To move the king, the royal engineers had to build machines. They created stairlifts made of heavy wooden platforms, thick hemp ropes, and iron pulleys. Imagine the scene. The most powerful monarch in Europe, the man who claimed to be God's representative on earth, being hoisted from one floor to another like a crate of cargo. The servants pulling those ropes were sworn to a silence that carried a death sentence. They watched as the king's massive, bandaged legs dangled over the edge of the lift. They saw the fluid soaking through the velvet of his custom-made chairs. They saw the Golden Prince reduced to a physical burden that required a team of 10 men just to move from his bed to his dining table. And then there was the smell. It was the one thing the engineers couldn't fix. You could widen the doorways so the king's massive frame could pass. You could reinforce the floors so they didn't break. But you could not stop the air from carrying the news of his decay. Cortes reported that the king's scent moved through the palace like a ghost. It preceded him by 3 rooms. Before you heard the heavy, mechanical thud of his pulleys or the deep, ragged sound of his breathing, you smelled the battlefield. It was a thick, sweet, metallic odor of dying cells. The servants burned mountains of expensive incense. They scrubbed the floors with vinegar. They hung tapestries soaked in orange flower water. It didn't matter. The rot was coming from inside the king, and it was winning. This was the curated lie of the Tudor state. The portraits showed a man standing tall, legs spread in a posture of ultimate strength. But the reality was a man who had to be wheeled into rooms on a custom-built cart, hidden behind curtains until the ambassadors were allowed in, only to be shown for a few minutes of carefully staged majesty before the pain became too much and he had to be hauled away again. The entire government was a performance. Every minister, every guard, and every wife was a reluctant actor in a play where the lead character was a decomposing predator. They all lived with a cold, sharpening fear in their bones. If the king realized they could see his weakness, he would kill them to prove he was still strong. In the Tudor court, the only thing more dangerous than the king's rot was the truth about it. The king was dead, but the Tudor machine could not stop. Even in death, Henry VIII was a logistical nightmare. His body, now a 400-pound mass of systemic infection and rapidly expanding gases, had to be moved from London to Windsor. This was a journey of 22 miles, a distance that, in the mid-16th century, took days. You have to visualize the procession. This wasn't a simple carriage ride. It was a massive, somber parade of black-clad mourners, flickering torches, and heavy wagons. At the center was the coffin. Because the king's body was already in a state of advanced liquefaction, the royal undertakers had to take extreme measures. They encased him in a heavy shell of wood, then wrapped that wood in thick sheets of lead. They soldered the seams of the lead with molten metal, creating an airtight, pressurized vault. They thought they had contained the king. They were wrong. As the procession moved toward Windsor, the internal biology of the Golden Prince was reaching a breaking point. Inside that lead coffin, the bacteria were working in a vacuum. Without oxygen, they produced even more volatile gases. Methane, hydrogen. The pressure inside the lead casing began to climb to levels that the soldered seams were never meant to withstand. The coffin was no longer a vessel for a king. It was a biological bomb. On the night of February 14th, the procession stopped for the night at the ruins of Sion Abbey. The coffin was placed on a raised platform in the chapel, surrounded by wax tapers and guarded by elite soldiers. This was the moment the curated lie of the Tudor crown finally shattered. In the middle of the night, a sound like a gunshot echoed through the stone arches of the abbey. It was the lead splitting. The internal pressure had become so immense that the metal itself had buckled and snapped. When the attendants rushed in, they didn't find a king. They found a crime scene. The rupture had sprayed the interior of the chapel with the viscous, dark fluid of a man who had been rotting for a decade. The stench was so aggressive, so chemically violent, that the guards staggered back, vomiting into their helmets. This was the unholy echo that the official records tried to delete. The supreme head of the church had become a fountain of putrefaction. But the most horrifying detail was yet to come. Because the chapel doors were often left ajar for the changing of the guard, the scent had traveled outside. Stray dogs, the scavengers of the English countryside, had been drawn to the abbey. They slipped through the shadows. They found the leaked fluid of the king pooling on the cold stone floor. When the morning light hit the chapel, the priests found the dogs lapping at the remains of King Henry VIII. The man who had destroyed the monasteries, who had executed his wives, and who had rewritten the laws of God to suit his own flesh, was now being consumed by animals in the ruins of an abbey he himself had desecrated. This was the final, brutal truth of the Tudor era. You can build palaces of gold. You can reinforce your floors with oak beams. You can rewrite the history books to make yourself a god. But in the end, you are still a biological machine. And when that machine breaks, the world sees you for what you truly are. Henry VIII was buried in St. George's Chapel, but the lead coffin they lowered into the vault was a scarred, ruptured mess. The man who wanted to be remembered as a mountain of power left the world as a warning about the fragility of the human frame. The golden prince was gone. All that remained was the smell of sulfur and the memory of the dogs in the dark. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.